And then lastly, handing on to Angus. Angus is partner and head of environmental law at SJ Berwin. Angus is also very much involved with UKELA. He's the convener of the Waste Working Party, and again, is somebody who's been very much involved in this whole process through the consultation, etc. And Angus is going to sort of wrap it all up and compare the new regime to the old one, so we can see if what we have now is better than what we used to have.
Well, thanks to Peter and Jill, who've covered admirably the detail of what environmental permitting is and how it all works in practice. You'll be pleased to hear I'm not proposing to cover that ground again. What I've decided to do is to pick 5 topics and issues which are of particular interest from a legal perspective. And these are really the topics which the Waste Working Party has picked up in the consultations we've responded to on environmental permitting. And then I'll finish up with some thoughts on the new regime, just in general terms. The 5 topics I've picked are standard rules permits, bespoke permits, waste exemptions, permit transfers, and appeals. First of all, dealing with standard rules permits. I have to say I think these are a fantastic idea. They work really well for smaller operators, and there are some definite time and cost savings to be had there. One possible downside is that you don't get a visit from the local authority or the agency when you apply. So that means an operator could, in theory, unwittingly apply for one when actually a bespoke permit would be more appropriate for their operations, and thereby land up with enforcement action being taken against them. It's also possible for the requirement to obtain a bespoke permit being triggered by certain external factors. For example, one of the examples given in the consultation is that of housing encroaching on a site and thereby infringing the requirement for a minimum separation distance, which means that condition of the permit is no longer met. And in that case, the operator is clearly going to have to have its wits about it, keep an eye on the local area, what's happening there, keep an eye on the local press for planning applications. I think there's some issues over when the requirement to trigger, when the requirement to apply for a bespoke permit would be triggered in those certain circumstances. For example, would it be on the grant of planning permission for a residential development nearby? Would it be on commencement of development? Would it be when it's occupied? And who makes the judgment call that a bespoke permit is required? Is it the operator? Is it the regulator? In terms of consultation and appeals, I think possibly there's been a bit of confusion over what consultation is in the terms of standard rules permits. There has been public consultation on the development of standard rules, but there isn't public consultation when applications for standard rules permits are made. I'm not sure I agree with the line that's taken that people have their chance to be consulted when the permit conditions are being consulted on. That, of course, is rather an abstract consultation. Clearly, when someone applies to build a waste transfer station next to your house, you would like to be consulted on it. The only route you would have, therefore, would be through the planning process. In terms of appeals, there's no appeal against a refusal of a standard rules permit. What you would have to do then is apply for a bespoke permit, and clearly if you're refused that, you could then appeal against that decision. One thing which I've been finding quite hard to get is any statistics on take-up of standard rules permits. I'd be interested to know whether anyone... 70%, Peter tells me. But I think it would be a good thing if the take-up rate were publicised better. because I think standard rules permits do have some real benefits for operators of smaller sites. Bespoke permits, are they any different to before? One of the really good things about environmental permitting is that there wasn't the rather complex transitional process which there was from IPC to PPC, which took 7 years, and as soon as it was finished, environmental permitting was brought in. What happened on the 1st of April last year was PPC permits, waste management licences, became environmental permits. That's nice and easy. Apart from the different rules on appeals, variations, transfers, is there any real difference between the previous permits, licences, consents, call them what you will, and environmental permits? One issue which I've heard raised quite a lot by industry is that of national permitting centres. These were brought in at the same time as environmental permitting, and I'm aware that there have been a few concerns about the way that some permit applications have been handled. I think it's possibly quite difficult to try and distinguish between the effects of environmental permitting and the effects of national permitting centres being brought in. My next point really sort of echoes a point that Jill made. Single site permits are a great idea, but sort of casting my mind back to my distant days at law school, and I remember my environmental law lecturer saying, we've got this fantastic system called integrated pollution control, and what it does is it covers all your emissions to air, to water and your waste under one permit, and it's a fantastic system. It provides a sort of a holistic permitting system for environmental protection. So why didn't it actually do that in practice? Why are we now looking at bringing in a system that does allow a single site permit? Again, if you want a single site permit, it needs both the operators and the regulators' mutual agreement, and as Jill mentioned, in her case, the regulator didn't agree, so they're left with numerous permits for one site. Another potential downside of getting a single site permit is the effect on your operations if it's suspended or revoked. If you have separate permits and one of those permits is suspended or revoked, it's obviously not a good thing, but you might be able to carry on your operations to some extent. If it's your water discharge consent that's suspended, at least you can carry on whatever you're doing with your waste and carry on emitting to air without committing an offence in that regard. So I think the issue there is it worth risking your entire operations for the administrative ease of a single permit? Waste exemptions were consulted on sort of alongside EPP, and the changes that are being proposed are intended to complement the environmental permitting system. There's really a wholesale review of waste exemptions. Some existing exemptions are going to stay the same. Some exemptions are going to require an environmental permit, although it'll normally be a standard rules permit. And some processes which currently require an environmental permit are going to fall under an exemption. The approach that's being adopted to this is a risk-based, proportionate approach. But I've noticed in some of the consultations that sometimes risk is used synonymously with size of site. Now, risk, of course, is a factor of the likelihood of something happening and the consequences of that event happening. But what it doesn't seem to take into account is the effect of site management and compliance on the likelihood of something happening. Clearly, you can have a large, potentially very hazardous site which is well managed, which poses less of a risk than a small, potentially not very hazardous site that's very badly managed. Some complex exemptions are going to require permits, and I just query whether that is in fact better regulation. Another issue I have with the exemptions consultation is that there is a proposal to phase in lower risk exemptions first. To my own mind, it doesn't really make sense. I would say that high risk operations should be phased in first. I do, however, think that the transitional period is vital. DEFRA is proposing a 3-year period from October 2009 to October 2012, although I found that yesterday that's just slipped. There are some 143,000 sites around the country which have at least one registered exemption. We don't have any statistics on how many of those exemptions are currently operating. But I'd query whether the Environment Agency and local authorities actually have the resources to cope with about 50,000 applications a year, because unlike environmental permitting, where your discharge consent or your PPC permit automatically becomes an environmental permit, you're actually going to have to apply for an exemption. In terms of the proposals for revising the exemptions themselves, one of the proposals is to limit the existing exemption for construction waste to the small-scale use of imported inert waste material that can be carried out without the need for a risk assessment. And this is going to be limited to 500 tonnes, which is not very much. The rationale behind that is to try to combat the abuse of the reuse of construction and demolition waste. But I think rather like with site waste management plans being brought in to address fly tipping, it's hitting the larger operations, which are actually generally the more reputable ones. What the Environment Agency should be targeting its efforts at is the cowboys at the smaller end of the market, not the big reputable operators. In terms of permit transfers, clearly under the previous regimes, these developed on a very much piecemeal basis. Before you had some permit transfers requiring a joint application, for example, PPC and waste management licences. Some required a joint notification to the regulator, principally discharge consents. Some you could just make a unilateral notification, IPC and abstraction licences, and some are not transferable at all, like radioactive substances consents. What we have now with environmental permitting is a joint application process, which I have to say is much easier. I really welcome that uniformity. It's probably less work for me, because after every asset transfer you do, you can spend hours working out what you need to do to transfer the permits. Now it's going to be a lot easier. However, for certain procedures, it's going to be more onerous. For example, where you simply had a notification to the regulator, now you've actually got to make an application to them, which has to be determined, and there's the risk of it being refused. I just query whether it's justifiable to impose additional legal requirements simply in the name of uniformity. In terms of appeals, again, I think the move to a uniform system of appeals is really to be welcomed. Under environmental permitting, you've got 6 months to appeal against refusal and 2 months to appeal against a variation or suspension or enforcement notice. Peter mentioned that there will be some exceptions for discharge consenting. At the moment, you have 3 months to appeal against a variation of a discharge consent imposed on you by the regulator. And I think that that's to be welcomed. I don't think that the environmental permitting regime and the push towards uniformity and common procedures should be used to curtail existing legal rights. There's a debate going on that was raised in the recently closed consultation on EPP2 in the context of discharge consents, that where you appeal against a variation, the effect of the variation is suspended pending the determination of the appeal. And I think on this there are really some arguments that work both ways. On the one hand, there's the argument that if the variation does have effect, then that ensures the protection of the environment. If the variation is being introduced to implement EU requirements, then it ensures that the UK complies with its EU obligations. However, particularly for water companies, their expenditure is controlled by Ofwat, that they have limited budgets which are set by Ofwat. And if they are required to make expenditure in order to stay on the right side of the law, and their appeal successful, they'll have wasted a lot of money, and that's, well, your money and my money, because we all pay water bills. Just to summarise, I'm fully in favour of EPP. It's a much more straightforward system, much more easily understandable. I have to say I'm not entirely clear as to the legal status of guidance, particularly in the event of a prosecution. Is it law? Is it best practice? Is it good practice? I think there's some questions there that need to be answered. I've heard some complaints raised about referential drafting, and the fact that to fully understand what the law says, you need to have the regulations, the relevant directive, and the guidance side by side and read them together. It's not perfect, but was the previous system any better? Probably not. I think on balance, referential drafting probably is a better system. Given the introduction of national permitting centres at the same time as the introduction of environmental permitting, it's possibly quite difficult to try to distinguish between the effects of the two developments. And my final point is that I don't think it's necessarily possible to fit everything into EPP. I think it does have its limitations which need to be recognised. I think the prime example of that is the mining waste directive, where I don't think it's going to be possible to implement the whole directive via EPP. I think certain elements of that will need to be implemented via the planning system. Thank you very much.